I received via an email today an interesting question about self-pollination, and I thought I'd share my response with all of you. So the question asked under which conditions prior autonomous selfing would be beneficial, and under which conditions delayed autonomous selfing would be beneficial. So let's think broadly about self-pollination first. The two main benefits of self-pollination is that it gives plants assurance of reproduction. In other words, plants can be certain that they will be able to produce offspring. And with that, of course, goes the idea that plants will minimize the amount of resources which are allocated to reproduction but don't contribute to successful production of seed. Self-pollination is also important for populations that want to avoid outbreeding depression. Typically this will be populations that are very well adapted to their local environment, and that will require the local environment also to be a stable environment. Otherwise it would be difficult for a population to adapt to it. The two main costs of self-pollination include the risk of inbreeding depression. Obviously, if a population wants to avoid outbreeding, inbreeding is not going to be a major issue, at least initially. But we do have to remember that inbreeding can reduce the number and the performance of offspring. So it is a serious negative consequence of self-pollination in some species. Self-pollination also can lead to lower genetic variability relative to cross-pollination, and of course that can limit the adaptive potential of offspring, which we know is important in variable and unpredictable environments. Okay, well, let's look at now the two extremes of autonomous selfing. First, prior autonomous selfing. So this is obviously a strategy that very strongly favors self-fertilization, and indeed the floral structure of plants that show prior autonomous selfing means that there is a very small chance of cross-pollination actually being able to occur. We would assume that prior autonomous selfing reflects a very strong avoidance of outbreeding depression, so the species wants to make sure that it does not change its, does not lose its adaptation to local conditions. And as I said in the previous slide, this really suggests the population is growing in a very stable habitat. Now, in contrast, delayed autonomous selfing seems to occur when cross-pollination is the desired outcome. So the species has opportunity to be cross-pollinated, and if that opportunity fails, then self-pollination is really like an insurance policy for reproduction. If the favored strategy of cross-pollination doesn't occur, well then self-pollination will occur to make sure that resources allocated to reproduction are not wasted, that they still result in the production of offspring, even if they're not of as high quality as those that would be produced by cross-pollination. Okay, now it's also really important to remember that while this kind of trade-off between assured reproduction versus higher genetic variability is one of the factors determining when we see self versus cross-pollination, and obviously also determining what type of self-pollination we might see. Self-pollination can also be driven by the probability of successful pollination within an environment. So we can imagine a scenario where cross-pollination really is the desired reproductive outcome, but if environmental conditions are unsuitable, or the density of conspecifics is too low, or pollinator behavior or pollinator success is too low, then all of these mean that cross-pollination, even though it might be desired, is very unlikely to be successful. And in that case, self-pollination becomes the best scenario because it's the only way to assure reproduction. It's worth also remembering, though, with prior autonomous selfing, and the associated floral characteristics shown by Cleistogamous species, it's unlikely that these environmental conditions are what's driving the self-pollination, simply because the floral adaptations really suggest that outbreeding is strongly being avoided. So it's not the environment imposing self-pollination, it is rather the plant strategy based on its floral characteristics to self-pollinate itself. Good, I hope that helps you all, and please remember you're always welcome to ask questions about any of the material, and if the questions are useful and broad, I'll try reply with a video response like this.